And welcome to episode 71 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, I'm going to give you an explanation of the Eternals teaser trailer that came out recently and an explanation for why this movie is coming out after the Black Widow movie that comes out in July, along with why it has to come out also after the three initial Marvel TV shows, WandaVision, Falcon and Winter Soldier, and Loki. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 71 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So in order for me to explain the Eternals correctly, I also need to explain how this is going to fit in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Keep in mind that the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with every movie, with every show, with every character introduction, has tried to take concepts that are in the comics and simplify them in a way and, kind of get it down to a point where it's much more digestible for the audience. So if you are someone who has read the Eternals comics over the years, or you're familiar with their origins by Jack Kirby, or if you're someone who, gets mad at almost every comic book movie because they're not 100% accurate to the comics, then I can't do too much to help you. But for the rest of you, here's why this movie is important. They're purposely placing the Eternals at a point in chronological order, not in terms of the MCU, but in terms of real-time chronology in the real world, because they need you to have an understanding of where the MCU is going after WandaVision, after Falcon and Winter Soldier, and after Loki, because there's going to be things that are going to be revealed in the Loki show beyond what you've already seen in the first two episodes that are going to intensely set a lot of groundwork for not just the movies moving forward, but also for different characters you're going to see show up in the MCU. So there are things that are going to happen in Loki that if you saw them after the Eternals movie, it would feel hollow. Same thing with Black Widow. Black Widow is going to introduce a side and an aspect of Marvel history that we've never seen before. And that's the idea of the Eternals movie. The Eternals movie has to do a lot with setting up history and setting up the future. Now, just a very, very, very quick, condensed explanation. The Eternals were created by Jack Kirby in Marvel Comics as an explanation for the history of humanity and an explanation for where some of the gods, lowercase, of mythology came from. Obviously, characters like Circe, Athena, Ajax, Icarus. These are all characters that are known in many different mythologies over the years. And the idea is that these characters are purposely used by Marvel Comics to have an explanation for where these mythological characters come from and why they've existed for so many years. In the comics, the Eternals were a race of people that were basically created by the Celestials in the comics, who are these basically cosmic scientists who were supposed to be the original, balancers of life in the universe, which is a whole nother explanation. I don't think Marvel's going to go down that road, but I'm giving you the explanation for the comics anyway, so you understand what's going on in the movie. The idea is that the Eternals were created to protect humanity and watch over them as they grow and evolve and develop. Well, the idea is that the Eternals, in terms of their genealogy, they're supposed to be similar to Asgardians in terms of their abilities, in terms of them having, special genetic makeups compared to regular humans. The difference is that the Eternals, as the name goes, are supposed to live forever. If technically an Eternal is killed, they're supposed to be able to come back to life. So with that understanding in mind, that's why when you see at the beginning of the trailer, they make comments like, seeing humanity make their first settlement is a beautiful thing. They say they've lived for centuries, guiding and, not interfering with the history of mankind. Until now, they say. And the reason why it's until now is because the more I've read and heard and observed about this film, the more it seems like that this film is going to follow in the path of, not directly, but loosely, Neil Gaiman's story about the Eternals, which is the idea. The reason why the Eternals haven't been involved as much in human history is not just because they don't want to manipulate situations, but because of the fact that at one point in time, they are all mind wiped and they forget who they are. In the comic, basically, it's the Eternals learning that they were mind wiped and they go forward to have to rediscover themselves and rediscover their origins themselves. And I want to have the feeling that part of the movie is going to go through the same thing, which is in their own effort to tell their history to the audience watching, they are also relearning their history themselves. And that's part of the reason why they were not involved. That's one theory. Another theory is that the Eternals literally have just existed for millennia and they just didn't get involved in things, which the movie's going to have to do a better explanation than the trailer, because in the comics, the Eternals weren't completely hands-off. So to have a bunch of superpowered beings can be completely hands-off for millennia and not interfere ever at all just doesn't make logical sense. And that's why, for example, when you saw the scene when they all gather out in front of what I think is supposed to be the city of Babylon, you see them basically dressed up, ready to fight. And I kind of have to think that that might be a hat tip to there being a bigger reason for why they weren't interfering. Because if they're interfering back in Babylon, which is in the BC era of human history, then there has to be a reason why for them not to interfere for, let's say, Thanos landing on Earth trying to wipe out the universe. Now, the other side of this is Thanos is technically an Eternal in the comics. He's just a Eternal with a mutated or deviant gene, depending on who you ask. I have the feeling that this movie is going to dig very deep into the deeper history of the cosmic Marvel cinematic universe, into an explanation for why Thanos is who he is, a bigger explanation for why superheroes have powers, and it will, in theory, then, if it does all of that, open the door for an explanation for why eventually there will be mutants showing up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because until now, there's been no explanation for mutants. There's been no explanation for why there would be mutants or X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even though everybody wants them there. And Marvel is just going to drop them in there and be like, all right, well, these guys have been here all along. No, they're going to give you a deeper explanation. So you need to look at the Eternals movie and the trailer as a pivot in this larger, bigger picture of storytelling for Marvel to introduce eventually having mutants, to explain why Wanda would have access to the powers that she has and why the Mind Stone would have untapped her powers the way it did. An explanation for why Captain America, when he received the super soldier serum, he had the genetic growth that he did in terms of his own physical and mental and overall abilities. There's all these things that go into these things, because in the comics, the idea is that the Hulk, Captain America, they all have something latent in their genetic makeup that allows them to have these powers come out and these abilities come out. Not just because the scientists did something right. No, it's because of the fact there's something in their own genetic makeup that has been untapped potential. Yeah, that's where mutants come from. The idea is that something happens in their puberty that causes them to manifest their mutant abilities. So I'm assuming at some point in the movie, you're going to have a similar situation. Now, what makes all of this also interesting is that the Eternals are technically science experiments. So we've already seen a variation of this in the Marvel television universe about a decade ago, when on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they introduced everybody to Inhumans. And then they had the debacle that was the beginning of the end of the Jeff Loeb era at Marvel Studios, which was the Inhumans TV show. But the way they introduced Inhumans to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was actually really smart, which is saying, hey, For centuries, there's something latent in the human genetics, and if we do this thing, which was at the time they called teragenesis, then the person can develop powers. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if there's something that's to do with the Eternals and humankind that is a similar concept that is going to be explained in these movies. So don't overthink the movies, because the Eternals movie is not just the most ambitious movie that Marvel has ever done. It's also going to be the one movie that is going to be the hardest to explain unless you've seen it. It's going to get to a point where if you haven't seen the Eternals, you won't understand everything else that comes after it. Now, that's a good thing in the fact that Marvel is spending and investing so much time and energy into making sure this movie is done right. I'm not condemning the Eternals movie because I haven't seen it, obviously, but I think we have to keep in mind that because the director is Chloe Zhao, because the fact that you're introducing a cast of characters that are completely different than anything you've ever seen, and because this is the most ambitious project that Marvel has done since the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, which in and of itself was a far-fetched idea when it was first pitched to a lot of people, I just ask people to keep an open mind with the Eternals show, because as you're watching these different other properties by Marvel, whether it's Loki, whether it's Black Widow, whether it's Shang-Chi, you got to understand that most of what happens in the show is going to have nothing to do with the Eternals, except for the Time Variance Authority in the Loki show. I'm not reviewing Loki here. I'm just giving an explanation. The TVA wants to protect the timeline. The existence of the Eternals is part of the primary timeline. Their existence in history is important to a lot of things that happen in history. There's a possibility that what happens in Loki, them having to fix things, has to be fixed because what you are going to see happening in the Eternals movie is going to have that big of an impact on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because whoever the major villain is, or whoever the major problem is for the Eternals, is going to have an incredible impact on the Marvel Cinematic Universe moving forward. And without a lot of information, I don't want to drive too much conjecture into what's happening, because at the end of the day, the only thing we know for sure is the Eternals, we understand what their powers are, we understand what they can do, we understand them when they combine for the Unimind, which when you saw what that those symbols come out, when they all close their eyes and are standing together, it grants them an incredible amount of power to basically defeat pretty much any enemy. Which is also where, if you've ever watched Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the Unimind is where the Japanese creators of the Power Rangers got the idea for the Megazords. This idea of all of these elements combining together. Also where they got the idea for Captain Planet. You know, all the kids get together, they combine their rings, and Captain Planet shows up. Well, it comes from the Unimind that Jack Kirby created. So if you ever wonder where some of these concepts came from, and you've heard the concept that there's nothing new under the sun, well, now you know. So I understand there's a lot to digest and a lot of, loosely connected things that I had to explain here, but I wanted to take a few minutes to actually explain it, because I feel like a lot of people kind of look at the Eternals trailers a few times, and it's a little bit too much to absorb and digest. And similar to the Loki TV show, I was telling somebody recently, you got to let the whole show play itself out before you make any decisions about it, just like you did with WandaVision. And part of that is because Marvel is telling these stories, and these stories have connections, and these connections have bigger picture elements that they are connected to. Again, as Kevin Feige says, it's all connected. Well, if it's all connected, then there's a reason why it's being laid out and played out like it is. Now, the final thing you need to know about the Eternals is each of their abilities is a precursor for other abilities. Think about it like this. I mentioned they were basically science experiments earlier by the Celestials in the comics. Well, the powers and abilities of all of the Eternals are basically what powers would be later on. Remember, Marvel doesn't get too ridiculous when it comes to abilities usually. So if you see one person has an ability, someone else might have it somewhere else. So, for example, Kingo's ability in the comics is that he is an elite fighter. He is an excellent swordsman. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that could be Taskmaster in the modern day, that could be Black Widow in the modern day. So Kingo is a precursor for them. Icarus, his ability is he is basically a advanced physical abilities. He's not the most strongest, most powerful, but he is pretty advanced. So think of him as a stronger version of Captain America. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is more on the level of, Thor in the comics, Hercules, technically as powerful as maybe Captain Marvel is in the MCU. So he's a precursor for that. Phastos is basically a genius when it comes to innovation and technology. So think of that as like a precursor for Tony Stark. Like anything Tony Stark can think of, he can make, right? Well, the same thing with Phastos, except he uses cosmic energy. Thena, played by Angelina Jolie. Thena is a weapons maker as well. So she is also a developer, a creator, but she's also an elite fighter. So think of her maybe as a combination of, let's say, Clint Barton's Hawkeye and Ronin, and kind of meld that a little bit with Dr. Hank Pym, okay, or Dr. Bruce Banner in terms of intelligence. So that's a precursor for that. Cersei is basically a precursor for Wanda Maximoff's Scarlet Witch. She is a reality manipulator. She can manipulate reality on a massive scale. She is arguably one of the most powerful of the Eternals because of her ability to manipulate reality. Character Sprite. Think of Sprite as a precursor for Loki. Loki is not some super powerful character, but he has the ability to use dark magic to manipulate reality, and so can Sprite. And Sprite is immortal. He's always going to look young, so he's got that going for him too. Makkari is a speedster, so that's the precursor for Quicksilver that you saw in the second Avengers movie. Or a precursor for the Quicksilver that was in the X-Men. Whatever version you want to use, it's still a speedster who can run extremely fast. Then you have a character like Druig. Druig is an Eternal with the ability of telepathy and matter manipulation. So he's got a little bit of Wanda Maximoff, a little bit of maybe Jean Grey from the comic books. So he's a precursor for telepathy and telekinesis. And then you have a character like Ajax, who has some of all of the abilities of the other characters, along with the ability to communicate with the creators and the scientific experimenters, the Celestials, on a psychological and mental level. And she can basically channel her abilities into things such as helping create plant matter and develop medicine. She is someone who can heal people. So while her character is not a direct precursor for anybody in Marvel Comics, there are elements of her abilities that are similar to maybe other characters as well. And then you got Dane Whitman's the Black Knight being played by Kit Harington, which is ironic because he was in Game of Thrones. The difference with Whitman is that he's not an actual Eternal, but he hangs with the Eternals because him and Cersei have this long ongoing relationship. He is a super genius. He is basically one of the most advanced minds in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. So he is a precursor for people like Tony Stark, Dr. Hank Pym, in terms of being superly intelligent. And he also happens to have advanced strength, speed, and more to go with it because of him taking on the mantle of the Black Knight as a member of the Eternals, which has allowed him to live for a very long time, even though he's originally just a human. So think of all the Eternals as genetic precursors for future superheroes that come along. So when they were the apex of human genetics, they are the top of the tier of human potential when it comes to physical abilities and talents and things like that. So everything you see later with superheroes, with mutants, with Inhumans, the idea is that the Eternals were the first to have all of those abilities. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I hope you like the podcast. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and of course, share it as well if you want other people to learn more about Marvel comic movies, TV shows, as well as what is going on in the DC universe We will be reviewing the Loki show when all the episodes are finally complete. Also, don't forget, I will be reviewing the Black Widow movie about a week after the movie has come out to give people time to actually watch it before I do my full review and explanation for that as well. Also, keep it tuned. We will be having more reviews of different show properties that are on the Disney Plus and HBO Max platforms, because that is where the majority of the Marvel and DC comic television shows and movies are located at. I'm Josh Hennig, at Josh Hennig on Twitter. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast.